We're going to talk about Alec, the American Legislative Exchange Council.
That's all I know, I just got the acronym.
Very important to know about. The one thing I learned about Alec was they were very instrumental in those stand your ground laws. They were very instrumental in getting those laws passed. So this is a very important segment of our program also. And this is Sarah Swanbeck from Common Cause. She's their legislative affairs person, and she works on issues of good government, ethics, money in politics, campaign finance reform, all the things we've all been interested in. All of them come together to make sure that we have a democracy in this country. And I'm not going to keep talking. I'm going to let Sarah talk.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, so I think we're going to keep on the theme of transparency a little bit here, but I'll talk more broadly about some of the issues that Common Cause works on in terms of keeping the relationship between our government officials and citizens transparent and open. So how many people are familiar with Common Cause? That's good. So actually we're one of the few groups, I think, who's kind of like a nonpartisan group working in good government reform. And in particular, I work for the California Common Cause branch here, and so I'm based in Sacramento, and for that reason I sort of see everything through the lens of California state politics, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. Alec tends to be a little bit more at a national level, so I'll give you kind of the context there and then talk about how it may or may not be affecting us here in California. But just to talk a little bit, for those of you who aren't familiar with Common Cause, we like to think of ourselves as the citizens lobbying group. So I'm technically a registered lobbyist, although I think they put advocate in my title instead of lobbyist because it sounds a lot better. But technically, we like to think of ourselves as a citizens lobbying group just because corporations can go out and hire themselves nice fancy lobbyists who can spend their full-time job in Sacramento or in DC lobbying on behalf of that corporation. So the corporation has a very narrow set of interests, and they spend a lot of money representing that narrow set of interests. And if you're a lawmaker and you're hearing from a few different lobbyists who have those narrow interests in mind, you might get the sense that that represents the broader views of the constituents that you actually represent, and that's not actually the case. And so what Common Cause tries to do is actually represent the broader public at large in terms of what you think government should be and how you think our public officials should act. I think we're pretty active and well respected here in California and across the country, and we have 400,000 members nationwide. And if you're curious after this, you should go Google us and find our website and join. So some of the issues that we work on in general, I can speak to. We do voting rights and elections reform, and so I don't know if some of you have followed the Supreme Court case that happened last year that essentially dismantled part of the National Voting Rights Act. So that happened, and so we've been trying to find ways to fight back against that. We do a lot of election integrity work, so around elections, making sure that people have access to the polls, making sure that people aren't out there waiting in lines. We fight back a lot against voter ID laws that have been tried to be passed that are incredibly discriminatory. We also do a lot of ethics reform. So for those of you that follow California politics, I started this job like 4 months ago, and since I started, 3 state legislators have been indicted or charged. So I thought it was me for a while. I guess this is not really normal. Anyway, so we do a lot of ethics work just because, beyond just, it being important for us to have morally respected officials representing us and holding them to a higher standard. We really do think that the way that you perceive your public officials is really important. It can be incredibly corrosive if people won't turn out to vote if they don't think that their vote matters, or if they think that they're being represented by officials that aren't actually good people or accountable. So we do lots of ethics reform as well. And then a big one for me that I kind of am passionate about is campaign finance reform. And so we've seen, for those of you who follow at the federal level and the Supreme Court and what they've been doing on this, they've essentially been, one decision after the next has been deregulating our campaign finance system. And we're kind of stuck here at the state level in California. There's not a whole lot that the state can do to fight back, except maybe try and get better disclosure. So the Supreme Court says, yes, as many people as they want can spend as much money as they want in our elections, and the most that we can do in California really is say, okay, well at least we want to maybe know where the money is coming from. That's kind of the best that we have going on right now until we get a constitutional amendment to overturn those decisions. So we're really working a lot on campaign finance reform here in California. And then also, in particular this year, California Common Cause is working on initiative reform. So for those of you that are familiar with voting in California and have to go to the ballot every year, every election cycle, and see 10 or 12 initiatives that you have to vote on, and it's not really clear what a yes vote means and what a no vote means, or you have to Google a lot to figure out who's actually funding which side of the campaign. So California Common Cause has a bill going through the legislature right now, SB 1253, and I left a postcard over there, that is basically trying to make that whole process more transparent, trying to introduce things like the ability to withdraw an initiative so that we don't have as many initiatives on the ballot. If a proponent decides that they want to take it off, they can. Things like that just make a lot of common sense, so that's something that we're also working on right now. So are there any questions about, I can answer questions about what Common Cause does since we're right here, but I can also go on to talking a little bit about Alec and what they're up to. Yes?
How does Common Cause decide priorities?
Yeah, so we have a national governing board, and then we're also represented in 35 different states, including California, and so the California Common Cause Board every year sort of elects what the priorities are going to be for the coming year. And some of that is negotiated with the national board, but a lot of it, California is fairly independent. So I don't know, for those of you who've been in the state a while, the whole redistricting process that happened in California, so the process by which we just finished redrawing all of the district boundaries for how we elect our officials. California Common Cause was instrumental in taking that process out of the hands of politicians who have a vested interest in how those lines are drawn and putting it with an independent commission. And what we've seen since then is we've seen much more competitive districts, which is what we want, right? We want more competition when it comes to electing public officials. So I don't know if there are particular priorities that you would like to see Common Cause address, but yeah, that's sort of how we do it with our board. Any questions? So I wanted to talk a little bit at least about Alec, so the American Legislative Exchange Council. And it's something that we're not quite as focused on here in California in terms of like my day in and day out work in Sacramento, just because, as I'll describe in a second, it hasn't been as active in California for a few reasons. So what is the American Legislative Exchange Council? It's sort of this like superhuman lobbying group in a sense. And also at the same time a front group, because one of the primary issues with the American Legislative Exchange Council, so it's a group that's made up, its membership is state legislators, so state level officials from California, for example, might be members of Alec, together with corporations. And so you have these two entities kind of mixing together, these state legislators and these corporations. And that, as I described right at the beginning, right, when you talk about a corporation and how they interact with our public officials, they're representing, right, that very narrow interest that is not representative of people as a whole. And so what we have with the American Legislative Exchange Council is a group that basically gets together to write model legislation every year. And it's these corporate interests that have a seat at the table with these legislators behind closed doors. They basically get together and help write legislation that would benefit these corporations. ALEC primarily is funded, so it's funded through state legislators pay dues, right? But they pay about $50 a year to be a part of this group. The corporations that are part of this group, on a sliding scale, kind of can pay anywhere from $7,000 up to $25,000 to be a member of this group. And the sliding scale is dependent on which sort of task forces that they're involved in. So there are 9 different task forces within ALEC. And depending on sort of the power of the task force that you're on, you pay more to be a part of this group. So that right there should be raising some red flags. And so, like I said, so a lot of the funding actually is coming from corporations. 98% of the funding is coming from corporations. And they get together behind closed doors to draft legislation that is of interest to these corporations. And Max, as you mentioned earlier, like a good example of this would be the Stand Your Ground law that was enacted in Florida that led to the whole Trayvon Martin incident. That was an ALEC model bill. And so what happens once these legislators, have drafted their model bills behind closed doors, state legislators go back to their states all over the country, and they every year I think they propose about 1,000 different bills a year, and of those 1,000, about 1 in 5 is actually passed. So that's a huge amount of influence, as you can see, that this narrow group of society, these corporations, basically have bought access and actually get legislation passed. That's access that you or I do not have. I haven't even mentioned sort of one of the most egregious parts of this whole thing is that Alec is registered as a 501c3 with the IRS. Oh good, most of you know tax code, that's great. So 501c3 is, I mean, a primary requirement for you being able to file as a 501c3 is that I think it's stated that, basically no substantial part of your activity can come from lobbying. And if you ask representatives from Alec, they still deny that this is actually lobbying. Which is just insane. If you actually look at any of the documents that have made public, they have whole legislation trackers. They have state legislatures on record is quoting that they take into account advice from Alec. Alec sends out kind of these action alerts ahead of bills going through different state legislators. So it's clearly that their activity is linked to trying to get legislation passed, which is the definition of lobbying. So basically what we have here is a group of corporations that are tax exempt in some way. It's tax exempt lobbying. And so actually Common Cause back in 2010 filed a whistleblower complaint with the IRS basically saying, hey, Alec is registered as a 501c3 and here are all these documents that show this is actually a significant portion of what they're doing is lobbying and you should call them on it. And so that complaint is actually still sitting with the IRS right now, so that was several years ago.
I wonder why nothing's happened.
Yeah. And so this brings me back then to California, what's going on. So if you look at the membership of Alec, it is primarily a more right-leaning organization in terms of the state legislators who are participants. And so I think for that reason, because California does tend to elect more Democrats and have more Democrats in the state legislature, we haven't seen a lot of Alec activity. So the only bill that I know of that was actually enacted here was a bill in 2010 by State Senator Alex Padilla, and it was a telecom deregulation bill that actually did pass. And it's also difficult to track Alec legislation because so there's an organization, I have to look it up, that actually keeps a database of all the known Alec legislation. And so the only really way to tell is that you'd have to have someone very closely tracking all the legislation that gets passed in California and trying to match keywords to figure out kind of the source of that legislation. But to our knowledge and to the best knowledge of some of these groups that actually track Alec legislation, so Alec Exposed, I think, is the website you can go to, and they have a whole database of Alec bills. But it's sort of a little bit on an ad hoc basis like that. It's very difficult to know sometimes until after it's already passed.